Good morning, everyone. We warmly welcome you back to our Bible study. So glad you have been awake and can join us. It's September 8th, 2018, and we are recording today from the Plainfield Christian Science Church Independent, Plainfield, New Jersey, the United States of America. And our moderator today is Linda from Pennsylvania. And before I go any further, before I forget, if we don't get a moderator, a volunteer for next Saturday, we will not have one for next Saturday.
I did get one for the last week, so that's good.
Oh, good. Okay, we got one for the last week. We just need one for next week.
I'll take it.
All right, thank you.
Who was that, Betty?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Betty. All right, so we're set for this month and be thinking ahead to October. Okay, Linda, thank you.
Yes, good morning. I'm going to start by reading a line from an article that was titled God as Love and can be found in Message from 1902 by Mary Baker Eddy. Quote, "Our thoughts of the Bible utter our lives." End quote.
Well, that's profound.
Yes, I thought so too.
And quite accurate.
Yeah, they're wonderful examples in history of people who have lived what they know of the Bible. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was certainly one of them. He was taught by his mother, both mothers, the Bible, and he just lived it. He had memorized it. It's how he memorized large portions of it. It's how he learned to read. It was just part of his being. There are many, many others. And that's what it should be. We should digest it and live it. And this is why we are having these Bible studies, because they are so important, especially today when it would seem as if the Bible like to be
Swept under the carpet.
Thank you. Thought is irrelevant, not important anymore, bunch of negativity, all of which is absolutely false, as we prove in these times together. Anyone else?
I'd like to add, I had found this quote separate in a pamphlet that was published through our church a while ago, and I hadn't really looked at the article itself, and I happened to open to it last night randomly, and I discovered it's actually in an article where she's talking about the first commandment, and that we're liable to turn away from the Bible as being impractical or hard to find out without the spiritual understanding of it. And there's just one other line I'd like to share because it was very profound to me. And she says, quote, "Minus the spiritual understanding of Scripture, of God and His creation, neither philosophy, nature, nor grace can give man the true idea of God, divine love, sufficiently to fulfill the first commandment." End quote. And I just really thought that was amazing that we need this to understand the first, so we can be obedient to the first commandment. And we need this science.
That is wonderful. And where did you find this?
That's in the same article with that quote, and it's called God is Love, and it starts on page 4 of 1902.
Well, that is wonderful. Yes, I don't remember reading that. Thank you. That's just so true. That puts it in its proper place, significance of our Bible. We should have both of those quotes in the library together. Okay, Linda.
All right, so this morning we're going to be talking about Luke 12, part of it, and the topic is Rich Toward God. And the first question is, what was Jesus' response to the man's question? And that was Luke 12:13, 13 and 14.
Well, didn't he tell him, who am I? I'm not a judge, but basically, he just refused to get into it with him.
So let's go into the background a little bit before we...
Somebody wanted just remind us what the question was.
And what the circumstances are. What are we talking about here? What's going on? Bruce, you want to tell us?
Yes. A man approached Jesus, and evidently there was some discontent with the division of the inheritance that he and his brother was going to get. And he wanted to drag Jesus into the argument as to make a decision who gets what. And he said, Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. It's interesting that he approached Jesus for some material wealth, but didn't approach Jesus about learning the things of God, getting his heart right with God. And it showed where the man's priorities were.
It was interesting. I read somewhere where this was a case of that, where the man was just thinking selfishly about himself, you know, what he was going to get, what he wanted. And in one other instance with Jesus, where someone was also like that. Anyone happen to know that instance? Maybe there's some more, but there's one other time when someone approached Jesus selfishly like that.
James and John, their mother, that said that her sons be with Jesus.
Yes, but that wasn't the one I was thinking of. But that's
Dives and Lazarus.
Yes.
Martha and Mary.
Martha.
Yes, Martha and Mary. That was the one. Martha saying, you know, why don't you get Mary to help me? So.
And why didn't you get here earlier?
Right. Right. All of that shows the human mind and not coming to the feet of Jesus in humility, but demanding something of him. And so what was his answer, Bruce?
Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you?
Isn't that wonderful? Jesus was never trapped into anything.
I love the brief and to the point response.
He just took it as an opportunity to address the whole thing of covetousness.
Yes.
Yeah, because he followed that with an explanation, didn't he?
Yeah.
He never lost an opportunity to teach lessons.
And also the reliance on material wealth.
When you think of how deep this one story is and what wonderful teaching he did, he turned it around. He taught deep lessons, more than one. And when he taught, everything was based on principles. That's why the Bible's so important. Because you think of today, how many people are arguing over inheritances?
So prevalent. I think people that are brothers and sisters, part of the same family, maybe they should have some sense of affection for each other. But when it comes time to divide the inheritance, bring out the worst in human passions.
Absolutely. I mean,
I've heard a lot of times after all that's said and done, nobody talks to each other. Not exactly what a parent wants to leave their children with.
yeah, everybody's fighting and arguing. It's a terrible situation. And so he took this and turned it around into a lesson, many lessons. And he would not give them the answer, one or the other, which is what the guy wanted. Go ahead, Sue.
Matthew Henry said that Jesus came not to be a divider of men's estates. He came to be a director of their consciences about them.
Yes.
So after his short and sweet rebuke to the guy, what was his next response?
Well, he told a parable or a story about a man who had so much, and he wanted to keep all of it, and close it up in a barn, and he had so much fruits and goods. So thou hast much good laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry.
And beware of what?
Covetousness.
Thank you.
Beware of covetousness.
Is that warning relevant today?
Sure.
What were some of the things that made the rich man foolish?
Well, he was going to waste time and money by building a bigger barn, and he didn't know if the next year he would have a great harvest as well. It was just a big waste.
And he just lived for himself. He had no inclination that he had a purpose besides himself.
He was already a rich man.
But, I mean, really, how much can you eat? How much is foolish?
So pride about acquiring things. You know, if he had an abundant harvest, how much was he thanking God for it and then asking God, what do you want me to do with it? There was a very personal, selfish sense of pride about acquiring things.
He saw it all as whose.
He saw it as his fruits and his goods, and instead of God's bestowing of His grace. So he made it very personal that it was all His doing, instead of, if he had seen that it was God's bestowal of grace, then he would have shared it with his brother too. But that required a spiritual view of this abundance, which he didn't have.
Was there any indication of his looking out for anybody else?
No.
No, none at all.
None whatsoever.
No.
That's right.
And what is the principle involved here? I mean, the Christian Science principle.
What blesses one blesses all. That's why.
On self-love.
Is good finite or infinite?
Infinite.
Infinite.
Yeah. And when we receive good and withhold giving it to others, what happens?
We lose it.
We have.
Exactly. And when we share the good that we have, that God has given us, what happens?
You get more.
Yeah.
It brings down infinite blessings.
He finds you trustworthy, so he gives you more to share. This guy had no concept of that principle.
This is a big... Sorry.
There's also a thing about take thine ease. He didn't want to have to be working.
Does anybody know any other so-called Christian scientists who, once they get their healing, stop growing and become content?
Yeah, I was reading. I turned, because there's a lot about this in Precepts 1. Mary Baker Eddy, her spiritual precepts. And Carpenter says, regarding what Gary just said, no matter how affluent the demonstration of an individual Christian scientist may be, if he stagnates in a selfish and self-centered satisfaction, he is not much better off than as if he had never begun his spiritual journey, since he experiences the same mortal destiny as the rest of humanity. If several groups of people start for the North Pole, those who get within a few hundred miles of the goal are not much better off than those who never started.
It reminds me of Gary's testimony a few weeks ago. He talked about how the purpose of any change is spiritual growth. You get all this stuff and you haven't grown, then what's the point?
Yeah.
Exactly. What's the point?
I hear stories over and over and over about the wealth of Christian Scientists in the organization. And I mean, we've heard of big companies like Sara Lee and Numbers and other things, a huge amount of money. The organization itself has a huge amount of money.
What are they doing with it?
What are they doing with it? Who is telling me? Oh, Suzanne, tell me the question they asked.
The lady was saying, well, some people have asked us the question, since you have so much money now, why don't you, make the offerings free on the website? Why don't you offer it at no charge? And I forget the exact response, but she just skirted the question. Like, we have other things to do with this money, and then they went on to the next thing. I was like, oh my gosh, what a great question. Why wouldn't your first, like we do at Plainfield, why wouldn't your first desire be to get the message out, which I think was what Mrs. Eddy wanted, everyone to publish Science and Health as long as they published it correctly, get the word out. But, yeah, she just evaded the question, I think.
Thank you.
They didn't even get the question.
They didn't want to get the question.
No.
And the only reason I bring this out is because it's case in point. So that's not real science. Not real science. The minute we got all this stuff, the one purpose we want to do is get it out and get it out freely. And how could we do otherwise? And we know that God will provide what we need, and we're grateful for those of you who have been supporting it financially. And then what I wrote on the forum from Mrs. Eddy, this is also in Precept 1. Mrs. Eddy constantly heard the cry of the poor, the sick, the unhappy, the sinner, and out of the wealth and overflow of her demonstration, she ceaselessly fed them, as Joseph, when he was the custodian of the grain, which he had gathered during the 7 years of plenty in Egypt, fed the nations who were starving during the 7 years of famine. This was the reason for Mrs. Eddy's growth. Students today do not grow faster because out of their abundance of spiritual good, they do not realize that much of what has been given them was for the purpose of sharing, not withholding. Lack of giving will stultify growth. Work done for God's children without hope of material reward is more surely paid for than anything else one might do. Therefore, no one can lose by giving more time to help humanity. If one works for humanity, he establishes a demonstration thought towards the world that inevitably brings him his reward, as well as fits him to handle the universal claim of animal magnetism directed against him. So, and you think of how Mrs. Eddy tirelessly watched, tirelessly gave, and if you read about her life, she was very generous to charities and other things. And Lawrence loves to tell about her bedroom in Chestnut Hill. Lawrence?
Oh, yes. It's just that as big as that mansion, her bedroom is, I don't think even the bed was a full-size bed. Very small. Very small. That was a shocker, really. I think everybody was struck by that. Everybody on the tour, I mean. It was just surprising, the size of that room.
Well, and when the house was originally prepared for her, and she saw her room, it was bigger than that, and she told them to make it smaller. She did not want a big luxurious-looking room. So they did some quick carpentry and made it smaller to suit her.
Yeah, I think it was something, she wanted something similar to what she had at Pleasant View.
Correct.
And not
Small and simple and uncluttered.
Yeah, it's only about 3 feet around the 3 sides of the bed.
Yeah.
She had a small, like, closet dressing room where she kept her clothes and things, but it was all very modest. And when you think of today, the homes that are being built, and you see, and you have so much stuff. I mean, that was his problem. I have so much stuff, I have to build something bigger to hold all my...
Sure.
Yes. Go ahead.
There was also a story of, I believe, she went with a worker to buy some chairs, and there was a lot of choices of fabrics, but the salesman had a bandage over his eye, and she asked him, Mrs. Eddie asked him what was up, and he said he had an infected eye, and the worker that was with her was kept admonishing her because she wasn't paying attention to the fabric. And when they left, she said, how could I worry about the fabric when this person was in suffering? So the next day, she sent the worker back to deal with the situation, and when the worker went back, the clerk was just amazed because his eye was healed overnight.
Yeah, and you see, that is a spiritually minded thought. But that quote, thank you, Mike, that was the quote from Precepts 2, that she heard the cries of the suffering. She couldn't ignore it and just be self-involved with her own life. I've said it before, but that's my definition of hell. All you have to think about is your own life, your own, what's going to happen to you. It is hell. And you will experience hell. I'll tell you, you will. I did. Get worried about everybody, everything, your family, and then if you have enough, and if you have so much, well, then you got to be careful that no one's going to steal it. It's endless, godless life, just the worst.
And it's been brought out in this church that when you do have a problem, whatever it is, you apply the truth that heals that to all mankind for that seeming problem. You don't look in, you look out, and you see the nothingness of that problem for the whole world, and that blessing goes out and out and out.
Thank you. Absolutely. Never just the personal healing.
That's why we do our watches.
It is. So great. You guys have been trained so well. So, well.
Also, from experience about farming, every farmer would have a good year and then they had to get bigger and better. And the only problem with that is that then the next thing you know is you need more workers and more this and more that. That's more expense. And so many farmers went out of business getting bigger. But then the other thing is that can you really accumulate more for yourself with all those workers if you're treating them fairly, and if you're trying to get them to do your work for nothing so you can sit around and be happy and be merry. That's not really very spiritually fair either. And if it's an abundance for everybody, it's one thing. But to just be selfish, it just creates more problems for the person being greedy.
Absolutely. So true.
And there's an ingratitude to it all, too. That they're not grateful to God for all of this increase.
It's totally self. And, you know, you think, look what a huge problem the South had in what Mike was just saying. I've said I've been reading this biography on Grant, and, you the slaves. So yeah, they had these huge houses, lots of money, but it was all based on slaves. It turned them into monsters, really. It did. And yet the exterior was also, lovely, but underneath it was just terribly wicked. And I don't even think that, I don't know, you just accept it as the way of life, not a way of life. Of course, it troubles many thinking people greatly, to the point we had
Ended up having a war over it.
a war. So you think the foolish man, first he thought that what he owned was his. That's why he was really stupid. Thought it was his. He owned it. It was his. And then he thought it was to be saved and stored for what?
No,
For him.
selfish consumption.
Yes.
I think it's interesting, his idea of, taking ease, eating, drinking, and being merry, his pinnacle idea of life was what Nabal was doing.
Nabal, right.
Abigail's first husband. So.
Yeah, eat, drink, and be merry, and be miserable.
I thought of the take thine ease, that he didn't have a sense of purpose.
Yes, that goes back to what Craig said in the beginning. What did you say, Craig?
Oh, I had said that he didn't. He thought all of this was just his. He had no opportunity to do anything for anybody with it.
That's right. With all this selfish, not seeing his real worth, his definition of life was all about him. It wasn't living for others, living to love, but it was to live to do what he could for himself.
I think that creates a sense of insecurity and fear also, this personal sense of this is mine and this is mine and all that.
That's right. And when children feel that, they rebel against it, don't they?
Yeah.
Because if your only purpose appears to be to fill up your stomach 2 or 3 times a day, satisfy the physical desires that come to you through mortal mind regularly, you're left with really nothing of any substance. And it creates the greatest anxiety, the greatest fear, and the greatest rebellion for those who want to get out of that mindset, because it's not normal and it's not natural.
Thank you. That's a very important point, because you see this type of thinking tries to perpetuate yourself, and you perpetuate it upon your children. You want to go to the best college. You want to make a lot of money. You want to build your bigger barns and and that's what you want to do. And then when they're miserable trying to do that because it's so godless, then they rebel, they turn to drugs, they commit suicide and other horrible things. It's immoral. But I would never have known this. I would have been, if I hadn't come to this church, I would have just been as blind as everybody else. Most likely I would have. So this isn't in any way of condemnation, but it's an awakening, an explanation as to what's going on with our youth. It's a really good point. You perpetuate this type of thinking. I mean, now this type of thing is disgusting to me. It's repulsive. Who wants to live their life so selfishly? No wonder children are so upset and miserable. And the more the parents think, well, if they go to the right school or they, marry the Ivy League person or whatever false aims and ambitions they have, the more the child rebels against it. His soul is not being fed.
I always remember a situation I witnessed when I was working in the hospital. We had a nurse from the Philippines that came through as a patient, a psych patient actually. She was very depressed, suicidal, and I'm talking with her. She said that she was not happy being a nurse, but she had been forced by her family in the Philippines to become a nurse so she could send money to them. And so even in a lower, what you may call maybe the poorer country, they still strive with that in the children. Oh, you become this because this way you can make money and you can. So it's like I don't know if it's this state of consumerism or what, but they push her into this. She was terribly unhappy and ended up attempting to commit suicide and being really messed up. I had also there was a young intern too, a doctor, that he said he did it because his family wanted him to become a doctor, but he was not a good one, and he was very unhappy.
Those are more good examples of the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is prevalent. It's not just an occasional problem. This is a prevalent problem.
Now, there's one other thing I want to mention about the foolish man. Thank you, Laura. That's a very good point. All of you are making very good points. The foolish man, he saw his security in his possession. That's why it's called the deceitfulness of money or possession, of riches, yes. Because you think, you are deceived into thinking that your security is in them. And that's why these people act the way they do. That's why you want your kid to get a good job. That's why, you come to America and make money and send it home. That's why, because that's your security. And that is false, isn't it? That is the horse before the cart. And if you think that, you're driven in a wrong way, and you'll end up shipwrecked on the shores of time. Now, having money and being comfortable is not bad.
It's a right idea.
It is.
When it's God provided.
And when you go back and reverse all the foolish things he did, foolish man, first to know that all things belong to God. Ultimately, you own zero. Nothing. You don't own your home. You don't own your children. You don't own this or that. I mean, it might appear you think you do, maybe you do for a time. You own things. Seems like it. You were a steward of it. But eventually, just as this man, what happened to him?
He croaked.
Yep, he croaked. And all of this stuff had to go to somebody else. So you got to remember that this is all, we're stewards of this earth here. Whatever it is we appear to own, it belongs to God. Therefore, we must be grateful to God for it and to take very good care of it. Be respectful of it. Not to just trash it.
But the last line of this parable is very telling. This night thy soul is required of thee. And I think, my take on it is that, yes, the soul is required. The sense of godliness is what's required here. So I think Jesus is also giving us the answer to this whole problem that he put forth in this parable. The thing that's required is this sense of soul or godliness. That's the resolution of the whole thing.
The resolution of the whole thing. Putting God back into all of the things. So we know that what we have comes from God. We need to be grateful for it. You need to teach your children to be grateful for it, not to be selfish, self-centered people who aren't grateful for a thing and expect everything handed to them. You have to teach them gratitude to God. And you do that by expressing it yourself. And then you have to know the reason why. Why is the reason that you have any good thing? Any good thing.
Because God loves you.
Yes.
And to share it.
Yes.
And he expects you to be like him.
And love others. And share what you have. And it doesn't matter how much you have or how little. You don't have to have much to share it. Share a smile. You can share. Mrs. Evans used to always tell people, well, just have people over for a piece of Entenmann's cake and a cup of coffee. Just have someone over for that. Someone in need. You don't have to have a big, elaborate banquet, for goodness sakes. Share what you do have. And then know that your security is not in that physical item. Your only security is in God. If you were to lose it all tomorrow, if you've got God, you'd be okay. Right?
Our security is in our confidence that we are indeed children of God. And if children, then heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. That came to mind with all you're saying.
Thank you, Ruth. Mm-hmm. And you've got to develop that within you to know that, yeah, all of the things, maybe you have a nice home or whatever, but without God, if any of you have led a godless life, you know how horrible that is. Without God, it's nothing.
It's the worst.
It's the worst. It's the worst.
Certainly don't want to go back to that.
So, Linda, have we finished question 2?
Yes, I think you did finish question 2. I did want to add that several commentaries that I read kept going back that Jesus warns against greed, all kinds of greed. And then the chapter 11, before this, he's addressing the Pharisees and keeping outside of the platters clean, but within all this wickedness. And what they really were doing was filling their vessels with food and drink from the stuff that they had extorted from the people of the synagogue. And it brought me back to the idea of what Mrs. Singletary was talking about with the slavery, during the slavery time, the type of thinking. And I have heard a recent preacher mention that kind of thinking hasn't gone away, it just changes form. And it's this idea that you can live off the back of others. And it can be very subtle because it's this idea, well, let's make others share. But really it's this concept that you're really trying to live off the back and energy and time and skill of others. In that sense of wanting ease and greed.
Yeah, the covetousness and the greediness, it goes back to laziness. Rather than do the work yourself, you think if you can get it from somebody else, that'll be a good thing. It is never
almost entitled to it. They act like they're entitled.
That's right.
Hi, I want to share with you some things I looked up based on covetous, and I found out strong desire, eagerness, a strong or inordinate desire of obtaining, possessing some supposed amassing of the material and not be rich towards God is what came to me. And covetous is very desirous. To obtain in a good sense, covetous of wisdom, virtue, and or learning, but it's usually in a bad sense and applied to an inordinate desire of wealth or avarice. So I wanted to share that with you.
Thank you, Ken.
Sure.
Good definition.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the idea is covet means to want what somebody else has instead of being grateful for what God gives you directly or indirectly. It's the idea of comparing yourself with others, which is so dangerous, which is why our children need to be properly educated, because they go to school and they're always comparing themselves with their classmates. And unless they have a sound basis in who they are and what matters in life, well, we all know what the temptations are.
I've given this story before, but it was such a revolutionary one for me as a child, because I know I used to covet things. Someone had a beautiful doll that I wanted, or we couldn't afford certain things. And I remember in Sunday school, Mrs. Evans was teaching the class on Thou Shalt Not Covet, and I wasn't in her class, but I had my chair tilted back to hear what she had to say, and because she was always interesting, even in those days as a Sunday school teacher. And she was talking about, well, what if a child was drawing this beautiful picture of something, and you really wanted it? What would you do? Rip it away from her, or try to get it some way? And no one could answer that question really well. I mean, you could maybe try to rip it away, but that wouldn't really work. And she just said the reason what you would do is you would make your own picture. Get out your crayon paper and do your own thing. Instead of wanting what that person had, do your own thing. Because God does supply you with ideas, and you're an individual. You don't really want to do what someone else is doing. Do your own thing, for heaven's sake. And I remember that just floored me. I thought, oh my gosh, I never thought of that. So, well, if I didn't have that beautiful doll, I had some little baby doll, and I made her as pretty as I could, and I enjoyed her as much as I could, and I was grateful for her. And that cured me of wanting that doll I couldn't have at that time in my life. But it has served me well, that one illustration. All these years, it served me well. Just do your own thing. Make your own picture. Grow your own garden. Don't envy.
Blossom where you're planted.
Blossom where you're planted. The simple, but all of these things that we're talking about, these are rules and principles of the universe. And if applied, they work wonderfully. And if they aren't applied, then you're miserable for the rest of your life. And it would seem, we all talk about, well, we're all loved by God equally. Well, it would seem that some people have more than other people. So what are you going to do about that? You work in your own vineyard. You make whatever it is, whatever you were given, you make it the very best you can. And it will take off, because that's a rule of the universe. But if you're jealous and miserable and rah, 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 you will just stay jealous and miserable and rah, 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 rah. Take what you've got and go with it.
If you want, I looked it up, and it's already deficiency and defect. I mean, you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to be miserable, period, because I can't have that. But when we start, starting out with God, which is, the first commandment, then you feel abundance and supply, and you're happy when you see others with abundance and supply, because you know that it's working for all mankind.
Yes, absolutely. So important. And I know Suzanne once gave a testimony, I believe, she talked about, because Suzanne's one that's always very happy for other people's good. And if you're not, then how can you be receptive to getting your own good? Gotta be happy. Go ahead, Mark.
I think it starts from not knowing who you are, period.
Right, it does. So you see, the answers to all of these things are in the Bible. Every single answer. And that's why we need to spend time in it, because it will heal your troubles, your anxieties, your covetousness, whatever else is troubling you, much more so than a drug.
Well, I know that God He's talking to everyone, and He's always nudging people. Along the way, He's nudged me in directions, and I know way back when I was working construction, I was in a store with somebody else, and they had computer things there. And I felt really drawn to this one thing, even though it had nothing to do with my life. and I started like learning about it, and it was sort of like a moment from there to here. Is the reason I can do what I do now is because I listened at that moment, kept going. So.
See, he was growing his own garden.
And I didn't know why I was listening, but I listened.
And you see, that's just how it works. You don't know why. Maybe you're starting out with, you see me have nothing. It's like the story of the talent. You're given one talent. Well, you take and expand on that one talent instead of hiding it and then hoarding it. These are rules of the universe, and they work. And the people that use it works for them. And then the disgruntled person says, "Oh, all right, they got it and I don't." Well, that's because Jeremy, he was listening. You weren't. You were so busy being miserable, you couldn't hear what God was telling you.
It's your own fault.
It's your own fault. People don't want to hear that either.
And you couldn't.
Oh. I might make it look easy today, but that doesn't say like the millions of pages I read in between. It's important to do the work.
It's just astounding how God lives.
And you couldn't see that you already had everything you ever wanted or needed right now.
Yes. Big Del Young has written a really good article, and it's called If You Say You Want. If you say you want, that means you're starting out on the premise that you don't have. If you start out on that premise, you're starting out on the wrong foot. So read that article. You already have everything you need.
Divine love is my shepherd. I shall not want, right at the beginning of the 23rd Psalm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There was that lady that had only the pot of oil.
Thank you. Good lesson for that. Yes.
And the widow's mite as well.
Yes. And the loaves and the fishes.
Yeah, the 5,000 that were fed by just a couple of fish and 5 loaves of bread.
He took what he had, which was hardly anything. So you see, all are without excuse. If you know the Bible and if you study the Bible. In Mrs. Eddy's article called Possession, she says, practice having a sense of possession of all things. Taking possession of what God gives us is the step leading to God giving us what we desire. If you take possession of what is at hand for you, it becomes the loaves and fishes for you, the basis of multiplication. Jesus' first question was, how many loaves have you? You must first have the consciousness of something to multiply. Keep practicing, this is mine, until the spirit of possession is gained, and you will feel all things are mine. It goes on. It's a beautiful.
Now, what's the difference between that and this guy in Luke that thought all of this crop was his, and he had to build bigger barns and all that stuff? What's the difference?
His mind is to keep for himself instead of it's mine to share.
Exactly. It is mine by reflection. As the child of God, I have access to everything there is in the universe to use for God's purpose. For God's purpose. When I see I have possession of everything I need for that purpose, there's no limit to the good you can accomplish.
The manual says that if the board disobeys, the will of Mrs. Eddy goes to the heirs and assigns forever. So if the board disobeys, those who are the heirs and assigns with God are supposed to get what comes from her will, and not the ones who have absconded in the wrong way. So if you look in the manual, look up heirs and assigns, and you see what's supposed to happen with her will provisions if the board disobeys.
And that's a reflection of God's abundance.
Yes, and it's taken from where it doesn't belong and given to where it does belong.
Isn't that wonderful? And so it's so true. And
Wonderful.
That's about inheritance. You know, when you're not seeking for your own personal gain, you are given abundantly. It happens over and over and over again.
What happens to a fool and his money?
Soon part.
He parts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Got that one, Jeffrey. Yeah, thank you, Royce. I mean,
you.
all these are
Very good.
All these are lessons, and you see people struggling. You know, I knew someone. I think he lived his whole life for his inheritance, what he thought he was going to get. So, not a pretty picture.
Mrs. Evans always says the hand that's open to give is open to receive. You don't do it for receiving, but it comes back.
It does. And you know, the father of the prodigal son, what did he say when his son came back? Son,
Have is thine.
All that I have is thine.
I knew Bruce would thank you. All that I have is thine. That is your heavenly Father. You think you don't have something? Think on that.
There's a saying that I remember. You receive but what you give. By this just law doth nature live.
That's beautiful.
That's
Thank
good.
you.
That's a lovely answer to question number 3, right?
Just cutting Linda right out of it.
I don't know. We're probably...
Wonderful.
Linda did a wonderful job of coming up with questions.
Okay, Linda, it's your turn.
All right. Do we want to say any more about what Jesus taught about true abundance?
Well, for us, abundance for us is what we know of the kingdom of God. Right? Seek that first, and all these things will be added unto you.
Like the calendar quote we had the other day, that the only poverty is the lack of knowledge of God.
Something like that, yeah. There is no poverty.
And we can trust that God will give it to us.
Absolutely.
Some people can trust that he already has.
You know that it's already happened.
It already happened.
That it unfolds. Bring it about.
Figure it out. You'll see it right there. You think of, you know, the stories in the Bible, and certainly Joseph, all the goodness, cheap shots that were taken at him, and yet he just kept progressing and unfolding and having a great abundance, being promoted. Sometimes you get tried, and you can get tried very sorely, but eventually the rewards will come, and they'll certainly come hereafter if you didn't get them on this earth, and there are those maybe that don't, but it will come. It has to. It'll come flooding forth. That's the way of it, the way of God, the way he created us all, with abundance, all things. When we use it properly, understand what it's for, and don't look for our security in that, but only in him. So shall we go to the last one?
Yes, this was a wonderful addition by Tom. I loved it, a connection in the Bible with the same concept of a temptation. And if anyone wanted to speak to it, Psalm 73. What was the temptation and how did he gain victory over it, the psalmist?
Well, he envied to begin with. He envied the rich.
No, that's not it at all.
No.
He envied the foolish for their apparent prosperity.
Oh, yeah, right. I understand.
And they were mocking God even, too. They were very prideful.
Right. He recognized them as foolish and godless. And he was upset because they appeared to be prosperous and sometimes even harmonious on the outside.
What about sinners flourish like a green bay tree, but the psalmist could see their end, the destruction of sin through suffering. So when we see some who are very rich, they could be sinners flourishing like a green bay tree, and we don't need to want what they have, because in that way it's not built on the right foundation.
Thank you.
And he didn't see their end until he, what was the phrase about, and then he went into the sanctuary of God. Yeah. Then understood I their end and realized how foolish he was not trusting in God.
Yeah, and his victory came when he saw clearly that God is the only friend and God is the only guide. That anything else doesn't cut it.
Part of his temptation, too, was that he felt he was doing all the things he should to follow God and was sometimes struggling. And why were all these people who weren't doing it doing so well? And there goes back to that comparison that Gary brought up earlier, looking at things incorrectly.
You know, that is such a good point, because in the practice, you don't know how many times I'll hear something like that. Well, I'm working so hard in the truth. I've been working, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, and so-and-so, look at them. They're living terrible lives, and they've got all this money and all this stuff, and I hear that a lot. Well, maybe not a lot, but enough that it's a very good point. I'm glad Tom brought it up, because it comes to people. And what's wrong with that type of thinking?
You're not grateful for the treasures of soul that you're gaining. Mm-hmm. You want material wealth, that doesn't cut it. The sanctuary God I understood therein. Yeah. For those that do that, the day of reckoning does come, but it's not for us to administer it. That's between them and their Maker. But it does come.
And you're outlining for God, which is pride, and that doesn't open any doors.
No, and you're looking to material things for the reward or punishment.
Yes.
And that's not where it is.
But that's a big fundamental mistake when you're thinking that way. You're in the wrong mind. And who are you to judge anyway? How do you know? How do you know anything about your neighbor? You're judging. You're making all these assumptions.
You think that grass is greener on the other side. It's only greener over the septic tank.
Leave it to Betty. That'll be our next Bible study.
Betty, I'm going to quote you.
That's the source of so many problems in this world. People see the surface appearance of things, formulate judgments, and then take actions based on that. It doesn't work that way.
All personal.
All human reckoning.
And material, yeah.
Yes. I'll never forget once, years ago, my son talking about, he had a friend in school, and oh my gosh, it's the most perfect family they came from. Just parents were so great, everything was so wonderful. And like a couple weeks later, the parents filed for divorce. And I mean, my son had spent time over there. The outward appearance looked really great. Who do we know? We don't know. Or the other thing, maybe somebody's fighting, it seems horrible, and actually they've got a good marriage or a good whatever. We just can't be judging people or estimating on surface appearance. It's very wrong, and as a scientist, you better not do it. Sounds very whiny to me.
And there's,
Some of them.
there's
Go ahead.
go ahead.
Well, please, you go.
Well, I was going to say there's one more point that relates to this that I think is important here, and this is something that Mrs. Evans drilled into us regularly, and that is, if you're worth something to God, I mean, if your heart is right, God will chastise you till he burns out everything that will hinder your growth. And while God is chastising you, you might feel like you're not making progress. You might feel like you're not doing as well as others around you. You might feel like you have more problems than others.
People might think you've got more problems, and what's the matter?
Yeah. Exactly. And however, if you're such a dullard that you're not really of much use to God or to mankind, God will probably leave you alone, or it will appear that way. You might kind of have an easy time for a while. And people might think that, gee, you know, you're having a pretty cool life. There must be something okay. But what does Mrs. Eddy say? The healthy sinner is a hardened sinner. So if you're having problems and you seem to be discouraged by having problems, well, trials are proofs of God's care. It may be that you are of great worth to God and he's preparing you to do even greater work.
Whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. And I've read Mrs. Eddy had this coming to her near her last years, and she was being purified even. So should we be surprised in light of just what you said? Whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. So when we're doing well, we're going to be further purified that we may bring forth more fruit. Thank you for bringing that up.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And look at Mrs. Eddy. Look what she went through. You think she had a bed of roses, but was that an indication that she wasn't a good Christian Scientist because she had such a rough time? Oh, yeah, she wasn't a good Christian Scientist. Look at all the problems she had. Well, that's why you can't judge so superficially about anybody or anything. So just stop it. Don't do it. Don't go there. Mind your own P's and Q's.
Well, Jesus, judge not that ye be not judged.
Absolutely. More times than not, you're wrong. So you think that there's some family that you envy and you think is so wonderful? Well, just cut that out. Mind your own business. Work in your own vineyard. Doesn't matter. Who cares?
And seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness.
So that was an excellent
Be
thought.
added to you. Everything will be added unto you.
Yeah, you will blossom where you are planted.
You will blossom where you're planted, and you'll see the truth about what's already there. It's already there. God's already given you an abundance. What is that the father said to the prodigal son?
All that I have.
All that I have is thine.
Think of it. Maybe
That's true
good,
right now.
Yep. All that God has is yours. You have to awaken to see it.
Not will be.
But he was jealous of the fact that his brother was being treated so well.
And that includes strength, health, everything, too.
Yes.
Another thing I like about this psalm is it starts out with an absolute truth. Truly, God is good to Israel. And he did that first. And even though this guy had some issues he had to resolve, he started with an absolute truth. And it opened the way for these things to be resolved, which they ultimately did.
Yes, and he was honest.
Yeah.
It's like a watch. You don't start with a negative.
It's right. Treatment.
anything else, Linda?
No, that was beautiful. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Linda.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Much. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all.
Yeah, welcome back.
Welcome back.
Thank
yes.
you. Okay.